For 20 years, the silence in the house had been a living thing. It settled in the corners like dust and lay heavy on the good blankets folded at the foot of the bed. It was a silence born not of peace, but of absence, a hollow shape where laughter should have been. Elam and Martha moved through it, their bodies accustomed to its weight, their gestures a language developed over 2 decades of unspoken grief. Elam carried whole winters in his eyes. He was a man whittled down by the land and by loss, his face a map of dry riverbeds, his hands knotted and cracked from work that never ended. He moved with a deliberation that could be mistaken for slowness, but it was the economy of a man who never wasted a motion or a word. The land had taken his first wife and the child she carried. Burying them both under the same hard-packed dirt, he still worked every day. He had built this house for them, and now he maintained it like a monument. Martha had arrived 5 years after, a widow herself, seeking not passion but harbor. She understood the language of his silence because she spoke it, too. Her own losses were a quiet ache behind her ribs. She brought order to the house's sorrow. Her hands were never still. They were kneading dough, mending seams, scrubbing floors, waging a gentle, relentless war against the decay that threatened to creep in from the corners. They were a good partnership, a pair of solitary posts holding up the same long stretch of fence. They shared meals, warmth, and the vast, aching quiet. They were not unhappy. They had simply forgotten what happiness felt like. They saw the children first as a shimmer on the horizon, a heat-hazed disturbance at the edge of their property line. It was late afternoon, the sun a smear of blood orange bleeding into the dust-choked sky. Elam stopped his work, leaning on his shovel, his eyes narrowed against the glare. 3 figures, small and unsteady, resolved themselves out of the wavering air. They were not playing. They moved with the grim purpose of refugees. They stopped at the fence, a flimsy barrier of wire and weathered posts that separated Elam's strained order from the world's chaos. The eldest was a girl, maybe 10 years old, thin as a fence rail herself. Her hair was a matted tangle of straw, her dress a collection of faded patches and rips. She held the hands of 2 smaller children, a boy and a younger girl, who huddled behind her like chicks under a mother hen's wing. They were all barefoot, their feet caked with the gray dust of the road. They didn't cry or call out. They just stood there, watching the house, their faces smudged with dirt and a weariness that did not belong on the young. Martha came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw them, and her perpetual motion ceased. Her hands fell still at her sides. For a long moment, the only sound was the mean whine of the wind stirring the dust. The 5 of them formed a tableau across the yard. The man by his shovel, the woman on her porch, and the 3 children at the edge of it all, waiting. The eldest girl, the one who seemed to be holding the others together with the sheer force of her will, took a hesitant step forward. Her voice, when it came, was thin and dry, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. It was a sound that had to fight its way out of her throat. "Please," she said, the word barely a puff of air. "Is there work? We can work. For food." Behind her, the little boy coughed, a dry, rattling sound that shook his small frame. The youngest one, a girl with eyes too big for her face, just stared, her thumb planted firmly in her mouth. They were not asking for charity. They were trying to barter with the only thing they had left, their own small, failing bodies. Elam didn't answer. He looked from the children to Martha on the porch. 20 years of shared silence passed between them in that single look. He saw the question in her eyes, the flicker of an old, buried ache. She saw the caution in his, the deep-seated reluctance to let anything new take root in this barren soil, lest it die too. He had built walls around his heart so high and thick that he no longer remembered what they were meant to protect. Martha gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a command. It was permission. It was an acknowledgement of the great, hollow space in their lives that had just been met with a knock. Elam pushed the shovel into the ground. He walked toward the fence, his boots scuffing up little ghosts of dust. The children flinched as he approached, the eldest pulling the other two tighter against her. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over them. He didn't offer a kind word or a soft smile. His face was as unreadable as a stone. He simply reached down and unlatched the gate. It swung inward with a low groan. "Come on, then," he said, his voice rough from disuse, like it came from under floorboards. He turned and walked back toward the house, not looking to see if they followed. He didn't need to. He could hear the soft, hesitant padding of their bare feet on the parched earth behind him. The journey from the fence to the house was 100 yards of contested territory. For the children, it was the crossing of a border into an unknown country. For Elam and Martha, it was the breaching of a fortress they had built around their lives. The children followed him up the 3 wooden steps to the porch, their eyes wide, taking in the clean-swept boards, the sturdy chairs, the solidness of it all. It was a world away from the roadside ditches and abandoned barns that had been their homes. Martha held the door open. She didn't smile, but the hard line of her mouth had softened. She stepped back to let them pass, and they shuffled inside, bringing the scent of dust and desperation into the clean, quiet air of the house. The house smelled of wood smoke, lye soap, and something else, the faint, lingering aroma of baked bread. They stood in a small, tight cluster in the center of the main room, looking lost. The room was spare and functional. A stone fireplace, a scrubbed pine table with 4 chairs, a worn but comfortable-looking armchair where Elam sat in the evenings. There were no pictures on the walls, no frivolous decorations. It was a house for surviving, not for living. Without a word, Martha went to the pantry. She returned with a loaf of dark bread and a pitcher of milk. She sliced the bread with steady, practiced hands and poured the milk into 3 tin cups. She set them on the table. She didn't urge them to eat. She just provided. The children stared at the food as if it were a mirage. The eldest girl, Lena, looked at Martha, then at Elam, seeking permission. Elam had taken his seat in the armchair by the hearth, his presence filling the space. He didn't look at them. He was staring into the cold fireplace, but he knew everything that was happening in the room. He gave a short, curt nod. That was all it took. They fell upon the food, not like animals, but with a desperate, silent urgency. They drank the milk in long, gulping swallows. They ate the bread in big bites, their cheeks bulging. They did not speak or make a sound other than the sound of their own eating. When they were finished, they wiped their mouths with the backs of their hands and looked at the empty cups, the last few crumbs on the table. Martha took the cups and plates to the wash basin without comment. The unspoken contract was being drawn. Food was given. Shelter was offered. The next part was rest. Elam rose from his chair. He gestured with his head toward a door at the back of the house. "You'll sleep there," he said. Lena herded her siblings toward the door. She paused with her hand on the latch, looking back at him. Her eyes held a question, a fear that was old and deep. He understood it without her having to speak. "We don't lock doors here," he said, his voice flat. It was not an assurance of comfort. It was a statement of fact. It meant she did not have to fear being locked in. It also meant she was free to leave. He turned back to the fireplace, his part in the transaction complete for the night. Lena opened the door and guided the other 2 inside, closing it softly behind them. The silence that returned to the room was different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The first days were a careful dance of avoidance. The children were shadows that flitted at the edges of Elam and Martha's rigid routine. They moved silently, took up as little space as possible, and seemed to hold their breath whenever Elam was near. They clung to each other like wet paper, a single unit of fear and hope. Martha assigned them small chores, testing their willingness. Lena swept the floor with a fierce concentration, her small brow furrowed. Samuel, the boy, was given a bucket to fetch water from the well. He was small for his age, about 7, and the full bucket was heavy. He struggled, his thin arms trembling, but he never complained. He would make 2 trips if he had to, his face set with a miniature version of Elam's own stoicism. The youngest, Maya, did nothing. She sat on the porch steps, clutching a small, featureless piece of wood she had found, and watched the world with her enormous, silent eyes. Elam worked the fields as he always did, a solitary figure under the vast, indifferent sky. But now he was not entirely alone. He was aware of the small eyes watching him from the house. He felt their presence as a change in the air, a subtle pressure. One afternoon, he saw Samuel standing by the fence, watching him split logs. The boy didn't speak or approach. He just watched, his gaze intense. Elam kept working, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only conversation between them. The house began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. There was the constant, soft whisk of Lena's broom. There was the occasional, startling sound of the well bucket scraping against stone. One morning, Martha came into the main room to find a small, chipped jar on the center of the table. In it was a single, defiant yellow wildflower. She stopped, her hands full of laundry, and just looked at it. It was a tiny splash of color in their monochrome world. She said nothing, but she left it there. The gestures of care, when they came, were as quiet and functional as everything else in their lives. The evenings grew colder as autumn deepened. Elam noticed Lena shivering on the porch one evening, her dress offering little protection against the biting wind. The next day, an old woolen shawl of Martha's appeared on the back of her chair. No one said where it came from. Lena simply wrapped it around her shoulders, its coarse warmth a silent message. Martha, in turn, began to cook with a different purpose. The stews were a little thicker, the bread a little softer. She found herself watching the children eat, a strange, tight feeling in her chest as she saw the hollows in their cheeks slowly begin to fill out. She was feeding them, and in doing so, she was feeding a part of herself that had been starving for 2 decades. Elam's kindness was rougher, more practical. He saw Samuel struggling to mend a torn strap on his worn-out shoe with a piece of string. The next morning, a small pot of leather balm and a sturdy needle with wax thread sat on the porch rail. Elam never acknowledged it. He was already out in the field by the time the sun came up. But Samuel knew. He spent the morning carefully stitching his shoe, his small hands mimicking the deliberate motions he had seen Elam use to mend harnesses. The youngest, Maya, remained a ghost. She never spoke. She rarely moved from her spot on the porch. She was a small, frozen statue of trauma. One afternoon, while sitting in his chair mending a tool, Elam began to idly carve a piece of scrap pine. His knife moved with practiced ease, peeling away slivers of wood. Slowly, a shape emerged. It was a bird, simple and unadorned, but clearly a bird. When it was done, he smoothed its edges with his calloused thumb. He walked out to the porch, and without looking at Maya, he placed the small wooden bird on the railing near her. Then he went back inside. For a long time, she didn't move. Then, when she thought no one was watching, her small hand darted out and snatched the bird. She pulled it into her lap, her fingers tracing its smooth, wooden shape. It was the first gift she had received that was not food or shelter. It was something just for her. A breakthrough came during a storm. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind began to howl, turning mean. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets. They were all forced inside, trapped together by the weather's fury. The world outside was chaos, but inside, the fire in the hearth cast a warm, flickering glow. The house, which had always felt empty, now felt like a sanctuary. They sat around the fire, the silence punctuated by the crackle of burning logs and the roar of the wind. Martha was mending one of Samuel's shirts. Elam was cleaning a rifle. The children were huddled together on a rag rug. It was Lena who broke the quiet. Her voice was small, but it cut through the noise of the storm. She was looking not at Martha, but into the flames. "Were you ever lonely?" she asked. The question hung in the air, shockingly direct. It was addressed to Martha, but it was for both of them. It was a question about the 20 years of silence. Martha's hands stilled in her lap. She looked at this serious, watchful girl who was so much older than her years. She didn't offer a platitude or a dismissal. She gave her the truth. Always, she said, her voice low and steady. Elam didn't look up from his work, but the rhythmic motion of his hands paused for a beat. One word. It had named the ghost that had haunted their house for 2 decades. And in naming it, something shifted. The silence was no longer an absence. It was a shared experience. A foundation of trust, fragile as a spider's web, was being spun in the warm, firelit room. Lena leaned her head against her brother's shoulder and watched the fire, her body a little less tense than it had been before. They were all lonely together. The thaw was slow, like the turning of a season. It was not a single event, but 1,000 tiny moments that accumulated like rainfall, slowly softening the hard-packed earth of their lives. Samuel started following Elam out to the barn, standing at a respectful distance, handing him tools without being asked. He learned the names of things: the adze, the froe, the auger. He learned the smell of sawdust and horsehide. Elam never formally taught him. He simply allowed the boy to observe and absorb. One day, Elam was planing a board, and without looking up, he said, "Watch your thumb. It'll take it clean off." It was the closest he had ever come to a lesson. Lena's domain became the kitchen, where she moved in a comfortable orbit around Martha. They developed a rhythm that required few words. A glance from Martha would send Lena for the flour. A nod was all the thanks that was needed. Lena began to hum sometimes, a quiet, tuneless sound that threaded itself into the fabric of the house's new sounds. Martha found herself leaving out ingredients for cookies she hadn't planned to bake, just to see the children's faces when they found them cooling on the rack. That loaf of bread she had first given them felt like a lifetime ago. This was different. This was not charity. It was care. Even Maya began to unfreeze. She started leaving her post on the porch, venturing into the house to watch Martha's hands knead dough, or to sit near the hearth where Elam cleaned his tools. She still carried her little wooden bird everywhere, its surface now smooth and dark from the constant touch of her hands. One evening, as Martha dished out stew, Maya looked up at her and whispered a single raspy word: "More." Martha's hand trembled as she refilled the bowl. Elam, from his chair, heard it. His gaze met Martha's over the children's heads. It was a look that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken conversations, a shared acknowledgement that the world was changing, right here within the walls of their home. The past, however, has a long shadow. It crept back upon them not with a bang, but with the clatter of wagon wheels and the murmur of righteousness. The inevitable trip to the town of Redemption for supplies had been put off for as long as possible. Redemption was a place of hard pews and harder gazes, a community that prided itself on order and propriety. When Elam's wagon rolled down the main street, heads turned. The sight of him and Martha was familiar. The sight of the 3 dusty children perched in the back was not. Whispers started, lifting behind them like dust from the wagon wheels. They followed them into Miller's general store, a cloud of suspicion and judgment. Mr. Miller, a man whose piety was as starched as his collar, looked over his spectacles at the children. He leaned on the counter, making a show of polishing a smudge on the wood. "Elam, Martha," he said, his voice oozing a condescending sort of concern. "Found some strays, have you?" Elam placed his list on the counter. "We need flour, salt, and 10 pounds of beans." Miller ignored the list. His eyes were on Lena, who was trying to make herself small behind Martha's skirts. "There are proper channels for these things, you know," he continued, his voice loud enough for the other customers to hear. "The county orphanage is a fine institution. They can't just be taken in. It ain't right." "They're with us," Martha said, her voice quiet but firm. She put a hand on Lena's shoulder, a simple, declarative gesture of protection. Miller sniffed, his gaze still fixed on Lena. "You should be grateful, girl," he said, his tone dripping with false benevolence, "that someone is willing to take on such a burden. Some folks might have just turned you out." He spoke as if she were an object, a sack of unwanted grain left on his doorstep. He was not just judging. He was stripping her of her personhood, reminding her that she was an inconvenience, a problem to be solved. The store fell silent. Everyone was watching. This was the moment of trial, not in a courtroom, but over a counter of dry goods. Lena flinched under the weight of his words, her face pale. She looked at the floorboards, the old shame and fear rising in her like bile. Then something happened. Elam, who had been standing silent and still as a statue, moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply placed both of his large, calloused hands flat on the counter. The sound was soft, but it echoed in the silent store like a gunshot. Mr. Miller stopped talking. All eyes went to Elam. He looked directly at Miller, and the winters in his eyes were bleak and cold enough to freeze fire. His voice was low, a rumble that came from the very center of his being. "They're not a burden," he said, each word as solid and heavy as a river stone. "They are children, and they have a home." He paused, letting the words settle. "Now I need flour, salt, and 10 pounds of beans." It was not a request. It was a command. Beside him, Martha straightened her shoulders. And Lena, feeling the steady pressure of Martha's hand, did something she had not done since her parents died. She lifted her head. She looked Mr. Miller directly in the eye. Her gaze was not defiant or angry. It was clear and steady, the look of someone who knew her own worth because someone else had just declared it for all the world to hear. Mr. Miller, faced with Elam's unyielding presence, Martha's quiet strength, and the child's newfound dignity, faltered. His self-righteous bluster evaporated. He blinked, cleared his throat, and turned to fill the order without another word. The whispers in the store died. A silent, grudging respect had been won. They had stood together, this unlikely family, and they had not broken. The journey home was different. The silence in the wagon was not heavy with tension but full of a new, solid kind of peace. The children sat a little straighter. Martha's hand rested on the seat near Elam's. They had faced the world and claimed their own. That night the house felt truly theirs. The fire burned brighter. The stew smelled richer. After the meal, as the children sat on the rug, Elam did something he had never done before. He spoke their names formally, as if making an introduction. "Lena," he said. The girl looked up, her eyes wide. "Samuel." "Maya." He looked at each of them in turn. "This is your home, if you'll have it." It was not a declaration, but a question. An offer. He was giving them the choice he had never truly given them before. Lena's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of arrival. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, a fierce, determined motion. Samuel, seeing his sister's reaction, nodded too. And little Maya, clutching her wooden bird, looked from Elam to Martha and gave a small, solemn dip of her head. The contract was sealed, not with ink and paper, but with a look, a nod, and a promise made in the flickering firelight. From that day on, the last of the ice broke. The house was no longer a place of survival. It became a place of living. A symbolic shift occurred, quiet but profound. One Saturday, Martha took down the heavy, dark curtains that had hung in the main room for years, letting the full force of the morning light pour in. The room seemed to expand, to breathe. In their place, she hung simple, white cotton ones that Lena had helped her sew. Elam opened up the old workshop behind the barn, a place that had been shut since his first wife's passing. It was thick with dust and the ghosts of old plans. He and Samuel spent a whole day just cleaning it out, sweeping away the cobwebs and the sorrow. He began to show the boy how to properly hold a hammer, how to measure a board twice before cutting once. He was not just teaching him carpentry, he was passing something on. He was building a future. One afternoon, Lena was helping Martha put away laundry. She paused by the empty wall where a framed photograph had once hung, its outline still visible as a faint rectangle of lighter paint. It was the space where a family portrait should be. She looked at Martha, a question in her eyes. Martha understood. She went to a small wooden chest, a chest that had remained closed for 20 years. From it, she took out a small, intricately stitched sampler she had made as a young girl. It was a simple thing, a pattern of vines and flowers. She handed it to Lena. Together, they hung it on the wall, filling the empty space not with a picture of a past they couldn't reclaim, but with a piece of a future they were stitching together, day by day, with raw thread. The house settled into a new rhythm, the rhythm of a family. It was in the sound of Maya's humming as she played, in the thump of Samuel's hammer from the workshop, in the low murmur of conversation between Lena and Martha in the kitchen. It was in the comfortable silence that now fell between Elam and Martha on the porch in the evenings, a silence that was no longer empty but full, brimming with the small, essential sounds of the life they had built inside. The final image of their transformation was not one of grand declarations or dramatic events. It was a simple evening in late autumn. The five of them sat on the porch watching the sun set. The sky was awash in soft purples and golds. Elam sat in his usual chair, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. Martha sat beside him, her knitting needles clicking softly. The three children were on the steps, their shoulders touching. Samuel was showing Maya how to skip a flat stone. Lena was just watching the sky, a small, contented smile on her face. The house stood behind them, its windows glowing with warm light. It was no longer a monument to loss. It breathed. It was home. Elam's gaze drifted from the horizon to the children, then to Martha. The winters in his eyes had not vanished, but now there was the promise of spring. He stretched out his hand, not to touch hers, but to rest it on the arm of his chair, inches from her own. And in that shared space, in the quiet twilight, a life that had been broken was made whole again. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. Anyone can pull a body from a river. This is about the far harder thing, the building of a home. It's not about the wood and nails that make a house, but about the slow, patient work of making a space where a soul can feel safe enough to heal. It's about the quiet courage it takes to open a door you've kept locked for 20 years, and the grace to let someone else walk through it. So here's your naming, for the ghost in your own house, for the quiet ache you've learned to live with. It is not a failing to be lonely. It is a sign that you were built for connection. And if you are brave enough to unlatch your own gate, not knowing who or what might stand on the other side, you might find that the thing you thought would be a burden is actually the bread, the milk, the one wild and beautiful flower that makes the whole empty table feel full again. You might find that the only way to heal your own broken heart is to offer its pieces to someone else.